Welcome to Jerusalem. Once more, this is the third day of our conference on Odessa, Cosmopolitanism, Modernism, and we have a packed program over 4 days. Today's program starts with session 6, which you have on your conference program. And just for those of you who have forgotten, we start with a session on sex, crime, and violence, chaired by Shmuel Barnai of the Hebrew University. And we have 4 presentations. So I'm going to ask Shmuel to be very, very strict in asking everyone to keep to time, and no more than 20 minutes per speaker, and discussion at the end through chat messages to Shmuel. Now, there is a change in the program. At 6 o'clock, we will have a break of 15 minutes. We'll have a musical interlude. And in session 7, there is a change. There will only be 2 speakers, Elizabeth Anna Abosh and Marina Sapritsky-Nachum. Professor Emilio Coco has unfortunately had to cancel his lecture. So we'll have 2 speakers starting at 8:15. That's session 7, starting after the break at 6:15, 18:15, all times, Jerusalem, Moscow, Odessa. And I'm now going to stop sharing and hand over to Shmuel, and Galina can share her screen. Shmuel, would you like to introduce the speakers, please?
Yes, thank you, Ephraim. Good afternoon, good morning, good night, everybody. And I would like, first of all, to thank all the organizers of this group, and particularly this conference, for inviting me to share this, I would say, the most modest, innocent, and chaste session about sex, crime, and violence. I would even redefine the title, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Jewish Sex, Crime, and Violence, but were afraid to ask. And our first speaker today is Dr. Ilia Gerasimov. Dr. Gerasimov received his Candidate of Science in History from Kazan State University, Russia in 1998, and another PhD from Rutgers University in the United States in 2000. Dr. Gerasimov is the executive editor of the Imperio Quarterly and author of several books. Most recent book is Plebeian Modernity, Social Practices, Illegality, and the Urban Poor in Russia, 1905-1917, published by University of Rochester Press in 2018. Dr. Gerasimov, please, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you for thinking of me in connection to this conference. I apologize for the quality of the video and particularly audio. I'm traveling, so these things are not fully under my control. And today I would like to share with you several observations based on my experience of studying Odessa, late Imperial Odessa, in the broader context of late Imperial urban society in the Russian Empire. Specifically, I want to address the problem of the notorious elusiveness of Odessan history, Odessan literary text, Odessan myth, that probably many of you have stumbled upon in your work. And from the very beginning, Odessa produced so many words about itself that it's often hard to say what we're dealing with, the historical reality, its literary representation, or with our stereotypical expectations of what should we find in the past and in the text. I'm afraid that too often we think that we know way in advance what we should find in our material and how to interpret it, and think that we know in advance what's special or specific about Odessa. I spent some 15 years trying to address this problem by reconstructing social practices of what I call the plebeian society that encompassed 80 to 90% of all urbanites, and reading these social practices as a text, as coherent text. As my German colleagues showed already 20 years ago, the public sphere of discourse and textuality was sustained by the Bürgertum in the Russian Empire that comprised, by most optimistic estimates, 2% of the city populations. And these people produced most texts, and the non-discursive majority communicated through social practices that I have identified, main practices as patriarchality, and others middle ground, and the third main practice as violence. The sharp contrast between social practices, actions taken by people, and their words and of these people suggests that our own language used to analyze Odessa and our master narratives that we apply to this material are often very inadequate to the task. First of all, there is a problem with the prevailing methodological nationalism, which makes many scholars to assume in the matter-of-fact manner that nationality was a central category in late Imperial Russia. The majority of modern scholars are unable to conceive of society not neatly structured by ethnicity, race, nationality. Even the absence of any trace of these factors in particular case is, or no trace of them determining human actions, is then identified as called national indifference, because nationality is perceived as the norm. So if there is, its absence is defined through its presence, negative presence, right? To be sure, there were Jews, Ukrainians, Russians, Greeks, Germans, and other folks in Odessa. But nation is a narrative, not just like a narrative as per Homi Baba. It is a narrative. And the absolute majority of Odessans didn't structure their lives and deeds by narratives. They understood them. They could use narratives, just as the Soviets knew how to use the communist rhetoric. But how many Soviets, all with high school education, indoctrinated by mass media and political institutions, how many Soviets actually lived by communist principles? Well, late Imperial Odessans were mostly illiterate, rarely read newspapers, and these newspapers were not so indoctrinating to begin with. To them, with the exception of the tiny educated elite, nation was situational and inconsistent. And as so were other narratives, grand narratives. So my second point is that not just nation, but all other narratives produced in the past had a questionable correlation with reality. For example, at the turn of the 20th century, even in plebeian culture, there existed a stable stereotype of Odessa as the sin city, something that was, touched upon yesterday in a couple of presentations, characterized by criminality and sexuality. And I would say this is probably why, in August 1908, a certain young woman, 18-year-old Jewish girl, Vera Galatskaya, traveled from her native Kremenchuk to Vilna to become a prostitute, and not to Odessa. Now, if you know the map, Kremenchuk, Odessa is to the southwest from Kremenchuk. It's about 400 kilometers, 450. And Vilna to the northwest is almost 2.5 times a longer distance of travel. And it's over 1,000 kilometers. Immediately upon arrival, she engaged in prostitution. But she traveled not to Odessa, but to Vilna. My explanation of this life choice is that This is an illustration of the power of narratives over not only later-day historians, but also on contemporaries. The narrative of Vilna was and has been as a patriarchal city of pious Jews, an antipode of Odessa. So this was the choice between trade, well, prostitution as trade, and explicit lewdness. This single personal case is corroborated by statistics. We think that we should find in Odessa not only entrepreneurial Jews, fragile cosmopolitanism, but also the ultimate center, the center of vice. But in practice, according to several comprehensive surveys, the concentration of prostitutes per capita in Vilna was 50% greater than in Odessa. And the share of Jews among prostitutes was also higher in Vilna, 40% versus 32%. Still, Vilna was popularly perceived as a parochial and quiet town, and Odessa, as we all know, played the role of sinful metropolis. There was no sex in the modern sense, as discourse in Foucaultian sense, in Vilna, but a developed sphere of sexual discourses and imagery existed in Odessa. So here's the problem. People were making love to each other. They were selling sexual favors for money in Odessa, but the modern notion of sexuality cannot accurately describe the experience without many important additional qualifications and clarifications. Likewise, thanks to the so-called Odessa School of Russian Writers, we all know that there was a special Odessa language, and it was developed and practiced by Jews. Some of you, as you probably know, some of you at least, some 20 years ago, I found real anonymous letters of extortion that were prominently featured in Bible's Odessa stories. And if I can share screen, I can share with you to show you a couple of pictures. Can I share? They look like this. This is one. This is the other. They're hilarious. They're very entertaining. They're very informative. We're back. So these are authentic, literally first-hand testimonies, not edited by the educated elite. The analysis suggests that there was nothing exclusively Jewish or specifically Jewish in these documents that arguably most authentically captured the Odessa speak of the special social milieu described by Babel. These letters are very suggestive regarding the state of mind of the plebeian society about its dealing with textuality, very complex, but this is a different topic for another day. Thus, contrary to the popular narratives, there were more prostitutes in Vilna than in Odessa. Yiddish speakers were slightly overrepresented among them, but probably not among the speakers of this particular Jewish Odessa language. This was not Jewish monopoly by any means. And third, that Jews, as defined by language or by confession, and this is not exactly the same, categories of people, they were also very prominent in violent crimes in Odessa, contrary to the popular trope at the time and today about Jewish propensity to white-collar crimes. In this regard, Jewishness as a national marker is almost redundant because it is uninformative, explaining nothing in Jewish life choices and practices, if they, in several important aspects, were no different than other people. In some cases, this factor matters a lot. For instance, when we discover that the victims of criminal violence committed by Jews in Odessa were almost exclusively other Jews. When read in the language of the Anthropology of Violence, this is an important testimony to the degree of Jewish integration in the larger society. To quote notorious American Jewish gangster from the late 40s, Bugsy Siegel, we only kill each other. Gangsters perceived killing as drawing a symbolic boundary of their community, and the proper right to murder or to be murdered belonged only to the members of this exclusive social group. and this boundary differentiated them from the rest of the world. Something particularly important in the situation of fluid social identities in an anomic society, such as an Odessan one at the turn of the century. This means that the most profound restraint for Jewish social integration originated not primarily in the outer social world with its legal discrimination and popular prejudices, but within the very same Jews who strive to become members of Odessa society just like anyone else. And to fully integrate with this society, they needed not only the universal political rights regime that was absent in late Imperial Russia, but also they needed a common public sphere, as a public sphere to partake in. And for those who engaged with the public sphere, the revolutionary project was one such possible political cultural version of the common social milieu, allowing its participants to step over their self-isolationism. It is only in the context of the revolutionary action directe that Jews purposefully targeted Gentiles as objects of deadly violence when Jews acted as members of anarchist political groups. Then they slain Russians, Ukrainians with ease. The revolutionary project removed the invisible glass wall of self-isolationism, and not only because of the ideology of national equality embedded in the revolutionary project, but because of the fundamental universalism of the public sphere itself and the structural condition, not just ideological message. The deadly pogrom in October 1905 seems to contradict my argument. By definition, the anti-Jewish pogrom targets Jews as a group. Again, the problem is that narratives precede and predetermine our perception of reality, making the perception of facts selective and conclusions pre-programmed. We think that we know why Jewish pogroms happen because the very term is infused with the ready explanation. But this explanation often contradicts reality and the practice. Think of the influential pogrom paradigm model. It seems logical inasmuch as it explains the dynamics of anti-Jewish violence, say, between the 1870s and 1905. But what happened to this paradigm in Odessa after 1905? Despite the rise of political, institutionalized anti-Semitic organizations in the city, there was nothing of the kind, not a single Jewish pogrom comparable to the October events in Odessa, even during the Civil War that was marked by genocidal anti-Jewish violence in Ukrainian lands. And Odessa changed hands several times, which was naturally a guaranteed prerequisite for a pogrom. To address this paradox, I suggest to work with a more neutral concept of the urban riot. It can turn into an anti-Jewish pogrom, but by no means can be reduced to a pogrom. Surprisingly, urban riots at the turn of the 20th century, not in the 17th century Moscow, remain virtually unexplored by historians. For decades, historians of Russia in different countries have been cataloging pre-1917 mass-scale unrest as either a demonstration of political protest or xenophobic attacks by Russian nationalists. Accordingly, they are classified either as revolutions or pogroms, even where no Jews were targeted or hurt, in Kazan or particularly in Tomsk in 1905. Framing the October events in terms of an urban riot allows to overcome deterministic explanation by anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is real. Targeted attacks against Jews are real, but my own research discovers no direct correlation between anti-Semitism and organized anti-Jewish violence, or the sustained nature of anti-Semitism, or even its persistence within the plebeian society, because it's non-discursive and non-textual, and a complex idea of anti-Semitism very problematically holds ground there. This conclusion is corroborated by the investigation conducted by an emissary of the Vilna group of Zionist socialists. He arrived in Odessa in mid-November 1905, 1 month after the October events, that in my interpretation evolved from a revolutionary uprising into a pogrom under the guidance of the city authorities. This anonymous investigator conducted dozens of interviews with victims and witnesses of the pogrom and documented their testimonies in the published account. The result in an essential anthropological study of the pogrom from within offers a unique opportunity to understand the mechanism of ethnically framed violence in Odessa in 1905. Observing the situation on the ground, we see that there was no single pogrom in Odessa with a common motivation and scenario, and no evenly demarcated line between the pogromists and the victims as Gentiles and Jews. Location, class, and personal circumstances mattered, playing decisive roles in some instances. On the basis of their prior experience, some Jews didn't see themselves as potential targets of the pogrom for a while, up to a moment, of course. For example, in the working class district of Peresik, the pogrom was imported by several dozen participants in the loyalist demonstration. The arrived mob began looting shops, short quote. The activity was organized in a systematic and rational way. Two looters break the door of a shop, get inside, then throw the goods into the street. And here women and girls were ready to pack the stuff into sacks and even in aprons. A picture that reminds me of the events on Michigan Avenue in Chicago last summer, more than anything else. The witness of one such assault was a Jewish worker who calmly observed the loot of a Jewish shop in the street, standing in the street by his house. In his view, it was just a riot involving looting, not a pogrom. I quote, "There is a difference. Looting is just when they take goods to benefit themselves and do it rationally, while during a pogrom, they destroy everything with senseless violence and almost unselfishly, even without benefiting themselves," end quote. So on Wednesday, the riot was sluggish, but by Thursday afternoon, the Jewish worker has become really alarmed and decided to move his wife and children away from the neighborhood. He said that he sensed blood in the air, even though he had not observed any physical violence yet. He was scared. What scared him was the aggressive mood of the crowd and the sight of agitated looters carrying away half of a dining table with only 2 legs. He realized that insanity, economical insanity will lead, will lead to physical violence.
You have 2 minutes.
So the riot was evolving from the looting of the well-to-do to an ethnically motivated Jewish pogrom. Invited from the outside, the pogrom gradually became local and self-sustaining. The dynamic was different in the village of Dalniki at the end of Dalinskaya Street. I quote, "A drunk constable arrived in Dalniki and said that the district chief of police had ordered the Yids to be beaten. First, peasants broke windows in Jewish houses, then gathered for a meeting, and afterward pillaged Jewish homes. Then they again held a meeting. After the second meeting, they set fire to houses where Jews lived, and even robbed peasants who were accused of hiding Jews. They didn't kill anyone, however," end quote. The farther from the city center, the more autonomous the dynamics of the pogrom. In the Bolshoi Fontan suburban vacation area, Gentile residents organized a communal gathering, just as they did in the village of Dalniki. Someone had, yeah, thank you. The microphone was up. Just as they did in Dalniki, to decide what to do about several dozen Jews permanently living in Bolshoi Fontan. So in these and several other local pockets of anti-Jewish violence, we don't find spontaneous outbursts of violence and unleashing of some deeply seated anti-Semitic feelings. Would-be pogromists held communal meetings to decide whether they should take advantage of the new situation. There's already a pogrom going on somewhere. Should we miss this opportunity? Should we join it? How should we respond to this new situation? So of course, the whole picture and dynamics of the October pogrom were much more complicated and requires special detailed discussion. Exactly for this reason, it can be productively framed by popular narratives of anti-Semitism, ethnicity, or religion. A microhistory of the pogrom doesn't show any demarcation into Gentiles and Jews. we don't see anti-Semitism as clearly differentiated from the negation of the institutionalized social order as such. So the language of the violence, through this language, we can read the Odessa society as multifaceted, torn apart by various tensions and held together by equally numerous and diverse bonds of solidarity. Religion and ethnicity were meaningful factors along with others, no less important, such as legal estate, class, locality, age, gender, occupation, and so on. Sometimes they matched in various combinations, sometimes they didn't. And we need to critically work with our language, our analytical language, to recover this more nuanced picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gerasimov, for your exciting presentation. And our next speaker is Dr. Galina Eliasberg. Galina has been an assistant professor in the Center for Biblical and Judaic Studies from 2014, and was previously also a lecturer on the history of Jewish literature, Jewish theater, and the history of Jewish literary criticism in the Center for Biblical and Judaic Studies. She also has published a book in Russian entitled One from the Former Petersburg, Israel Zinberg, Historian of Jewish Literature, Critic and Publicist, published in Moscow in 2005. And Galina is going to speak today about the Odessa in Semën Iushkevich œuvre, and Galina will deliver her speech in Russian. Пожалуйста, прошу вас. Уберите мьют, пожалуйста. Мы вас не слышим. Вот теперь, да.
Thank you very much for this presentation, and thank you for the organizer of this conference. Я буду говорить об образе Одессы в творчестве Иushkevich. Его творчество, собственно говоря, показывает нам Одессу на протяжении нескольких десятилетий, с конца XIX по 20-е годы XX века. Образ Одессы и изображение приморского многонационального города во всем многообразии его социальных и этнонациональных групп можно рассматривать как значимый претекст к произведениям, созданным в советский период в рамках юго-западной литературной школы 20-30-х годов, включая, собственно, и тексты Исаака Бабеля. Русские критики начала 900-х годов называли Иushkevich региональным писателем и подчеркивали влияние на него модернистских течений начала века. И об этом писали, например, критики Богданович и Стечкин. В то же самое время еврейские либеральные критики Гарнфельд и Цинберг, автор известной статьи «Ассимилированный бытописатель еврейства», который как бы закрепила вот такое отношение к нему в еврейской среде, к Иushkevich, конечно же, рассматривал его произведение вот в контексте проблем еврейской ассимиляции. Отдельно стоит сказать о статьях Жаботинского 1908 годов в газетах «Русь» и «Рассвет», где Жаботинский подчеркивал вообще значение его текстов, которые рассматривал в комплексе русско-еврейской литературы. Или литература о евреях, написанной на русском языке. И его алитературенных героев Жаботинский сравнивал с алитературенными ходульными босяками Горького, с горьковской критикой мещанства в произведениях драматургических и прозаических. В дальнейшем в статье 27 года, опубликованной в «Рассвете», в связи с выходом перевода на идиш эпизодов Иushkevich, эпизоды, так назывался цикл рассказов 23 года, Жаботинский подчеркивал как раз принадлежность Iushkevich к еврейским писателям и еврейской литературе. И как раз указывал на то, что еврейский контекст, компонент как бы ярко проявился именно в переводе его текстов на идыш. Нам важно подчеркнуть, что образ Одессы рубежа 19-20 веков становится важнейшим в творчестве Iushkevich, и Одесса будет тем фоном, на котором развертываются его произведения. Ну, в этом докладе мне хотелось бы показать тесную связь городского пространства Одессы с важнейшими идейными представлениями Iushkevich и с важнейшими социально-тематическими циклами его прозаических и театральных произведений. Вот согласно периодизации его творчества, представленной в статье Ходосевича в сборнике «Посмертные произведения Iushkevich». И Ходосевич выделял первый период такие рассказы, как «Распад» и «Тагайны евреи», где различимо ясно социальный мотив, где речь идет о еврейской городской нищете. Затем второй период, середины 900-х годов, по мысли Ходосевича, автор от описательства обращается к драматургии, создается два как бы больших цикла его пьес. Сначала социальной проблематики, трилогия «Голод в городе и король», и затем он пишет о пьесах послереволюционного периода Мендельспивак «Человек воздуха». Как бы Ходосевич называет это вторым этапом в драматургии Iushkevich. И затем, пишет Ходосевич, внимание художника перемещается в сторону толстых. И с 1907 года создаются такие гротескные произведения, как комедия «Брака», без «Человек воздуха». И таким образом в рамках третьего социалистического периода Ходосевич рассматривает и прозаические, и драматургические произведения, включая и публикации 20-х годов, цикл, объединенный под названием «Дудька», и эпизоды 23-го года. Теоретические подходы к концепции локуса в литературных текстах базируются на подходах Лотмана и Топорова. Мы учитываем также авторитетные работы, посвященные многонациональной Одессе, монографии Кинга, Зипперштейна, Полищука, Клира. Важны также подходы к проблеме одесского текста в публикациях Скуратовского, Мирьям Леки, Леонида Кациса. Следует также упомянуть работы, посвященные специфике городского языка, одесского языка и способу его передачи в литературных текстах. И на эти особенности обращали внимание многие, начиная со статьи Жаботинского 1908 года, ну и не только, но вплоть до значимо, конечно, сопоставления словаря писателя с маркерами одесского текста, которые отражены в работах профессора Степанова и его коллег. В ранней повести «Пролог», повесть 903 года, Iushkevich описал знаменитый Одесский порт, нелегкие судьбы его рабочих, украинцев и русских. В очерках детства, 907 год, он изобразил мир ребенка у берегов Черного моря, его герои, мальчики Павка и Коля, играют на берегу. Iushkevich пишет об их волнениях и страхах, но все же главным героем, главной темой, объединяющей все этапы творчества писателя, стало изображение еврейских обитателей Одессы во всем разнообразии их социальных групп. В письме к Венгерму, которую писал Iushkevich для словаря русских писателей, он отмечал: первой большой работой мой был рассказ «Распад», написанный в Париже, кажется, в декабре 1994 года или в январе 1995. В 1996 году я написал рассказ «Портной». Предстояло решить, кому предложить рассказ. Я предложил Короленко, ответ, конечно, получился благоприятный. Упоминаю об этом эпизоде, потому что когда у меня зародилась мысль о крайней важности писать рассказы из еврейской жизни, что изображение жизни русских евреев должно найти свое место в русской литературе. И важной темой его прозы становится изображение города и как бы бытового уклада жизни бедняков. Оба ранних произведения, и «Повесть «Распад», и «Портной» были написаны в Париже, как уже говорилось. «Повесть «Распад» ставила вопрос о самосознании евреев рубежной эпохи, и, собственно, в ее названии отражены, с одной стороны, главный конфликт, слом традиционных семейных, религиозных, духовных связей еврейства, а с другой стороны, она тематически связана с модернистскими течениями, с изображавшими распад дворянских гнезд, деревни, мещанской семьи, нравственных основ обитателей городского дна. Вот эта повесть «Распад» во многом автобиографична, и в ней проявился интерес писателя к новым приемам художественной выразительности. Он показал уклад жизни мещанской семьи и борьбу Розановых за сохранение социального статуса, в том числе и за счет криминальных действий матери семейства. Можно говорить, да, ну вот о ряде биографических деталей. Иушкевич показал не только быт семейства Розановых, но и город в его индустриальном развитии, строительство дорог, прокладка трамвайных линий, парки, порт, мелкие лавочки, магазины. Здесь и скромные жилища бедняков, речь которых он наделил узнаваемыми маркерами еврейской речи. Но повесть эта была издана только в 1902 году. Ну и важно сказать, что вот в монологе старика Розанова представлен образ города как муравейника. В рассказе «Портной» это первое напечатанное произведение Иушкевича, и он появился в журнале «Русское богатство», и сам этот рассказ, собственно, в народническом духе. Это история портного Иерохима, кормильца многодетной семьи, теряющего зрение, и как бы такой крах семьи под натиском нищеты, как писал Иушкевич. И хотя основное действие происходит в квартире Иерохима, но тема большого города значимо присутствует в рассказе. Это описание наемного жилья, лавочек, мастерских, толкучего рынка. И это движение, скитание героев в поисках работы и помощи. Так Иушкевич пишет, цитирую: «Одно время Цыпка, жена Иерохима, бегала по городу с дикой мыслью найти 4 рубля на улице и, как помешанная, набрасывалась на каждую цветную бумажку, попавшуюся ей на пути». Ну, как и во многих других произведениях, Иушкевич не указывает название города, но по ряду деталей можно понять, что речь идет именно об Одессе. Например, там упоминается удачливый купец, заработавший 200 тысяч на продаже зерна и так далее. Здесь же упоминается и история жены Лейзера Цыпки, которая росла в польском местечке, но вынуждена была бежать в город, скрывая свою беременность, и работала до замужества на прислуге. И вот история прислугой. История соблазнения девочек-подростков, страданий юных матерей развивается в дальнейшем в рассказах Ита Гайны, рассказ 1902 года, и в рассказе «Нашей сестры» 1903 года. В рассказе Ита Гайны показана судьба кормилец, приезжающих в большой город на заработки. Героиня Ита Гайна с младенцем приходит к факторше Розе Бельрот, и она поставляет кормилец в богатые дома. То есть вот эта деятельность показана как одна из сторон быта города. Роза Бельрот обещает заботу о младенцах, но на самом деле дети гибнут от недоедания, антисанитарии и болезней. Но такая индустрия как бы нужна городу, цитирую. В самое горячее время, когда требование на кормилец случалось огромное, Роза никогда не была в затруднении. Уходила на нас с раннего утра, возвращалась с партии женщин, с которыми оживленно разговаривала, объясняя по-русски, по-еврейски, то по-малороссийски, а даже по-польски, как вести и держать себя с нанимателем. Городская волна мерно продолжала то поглощать, то выбрасывать определенное количество наемниц. Конец цитаты. В рассказе «Наши сестры» приводится история 3 дочерей базарной торговки Оснос. И в центре повествования судьба старшей Маси, которую устроили в прислуге. Мася со своей подругой Шейнбу отправилась в город, но понятно, что история заканчивается трагически. Мася родила ребенка от сына хозяина, ее выгнали, и потом она решается на преступление, душит младенца подушкой. Девочки, то есть тоже Иushkevich показывает одну из сторон вот этой жизни города, жизни прислуг. Девочек нанимают в богатые семьи, но помимо хозяйственных забот, эти служанки-невольницы определения автора оказываются во власти сыновей гимназистов, их соблазняющих при молчаливом согласии матерей. И потому что богатых родителей заботит здоровье сыновей, а не судьбы бедных девушек. Здесь дается контраст бедных жилищ окраин и богатых домов. Описан знаменитый дом для бедняков, где в 1,5 коморках квартирах жило до 1000 человек. Это был длинный узкий двор с 6 полутораэтажными серыми корпусами со всеми его бедняками. Показан и богатый дом, и там такой быт многоквартирного дома, где имеется кухня, и кухня – это словно цех, куда приходят кухарки готовить, обсуждать хозяев, обсуждать свои проблемы. Цитата. «Кухня ожила, горела плита, поднимался пар, плясали крышки на кастрюлях. Все говорили о хозяевах. Какими пошлыми, хищными, нечеловеческими выходили фигуры господ, домохозяев, лавочников, ростовщиков, банкиров, требовавших за постыдно ничтожное вознаграждение все и девушки. Богатые и сильные, швырявшие деньгами, они бессердечно обворовывали своих слуг». В 1903 году была издана повесть Иushkevича «Пролог». И о работе над этим произведением Iushkevich писал в письме к Айзману, который находится в коллекции Рогалей. Письмо не датировано, но по ряду, упоминаний можно понять, что оно написано осенью 1903 года. Во-первых, там упоминается смерть Эмиля Золя. Смерть Золя, цитирую. «Смерть Золя такая ужасная, такая ранняя, меня страшно огорчила. Как дорогого брата, отца я потерял и до сих пор не могу опомниться. Лишь теперь оценят они колоссальный талант, колоссальное сердце. У нас Горького за его Фому в гении произвели, а весь Фома уместится в одной четверти любого романа Золя. Как я не преклоняюсь перед Толстым, но колоссальный литературный исторический материал дает Золя». Ну и дальше он там просит прислать ему некрологи. То есть я говорю о том, что в это время он работает как раз над рассказом «Наши сестры» и вот повестью, который потом назовет «Пролог». И это в этом ключе, вот такого натуралистического направления, можно рассматривать создание образа города.
Галина, у вас 3 минуты. Если...
Да, создание образа города, да, вот по модели, похожей на то, что писал Золя. Одесский порт становится важным таким действующим лицом этой повести. И он показан, опять же, в разное время года. Можно упомянуть еще о цикле, который называется «Улица». И особо мне хочется сказать о романе «Леон Дрей». Это известный роман, который вызвал массу полемики, но тем не менее там Iushkevich также использует приемы показа города в соответствии с социальным статусом, которого достигает его герой-негодяй. И не случайно, вот, собственно говоря, в 10-е годы Ханжонков экранизирует первую часть этого романа. Город в годы революции, понятно, что Iushkevich принял февральскую революцию, он оставался в Одессе до 20-го года, и особо, в смысле судьбой города, описание пространства, мне хочется сказать о цикле, который называется «Дудька», и это рассказ обогащения негодяя в такую вот в эпоху войн, да, и революций, и, конечно же, эпизоды Iushkevich, где он описал, собственно говоря, город, в котором теперь униженные и оскорбленные стали хозяевами жизни, и все богатые дома превращаются, значит, в убогие холодные жилища. Он описывает подвалы чрезвычайки, он описывает советские учреждения, и этот сатирический роман, в общем-то, показывает такую трагедию, драму жителей города и изменения вот городского ландшафта. Спасибо, я закончила.
Спасибо большое, Галина. Спасибо за вашу презентацию. Thank you for your exciting presentation. And we are going to our next speaker, also about Semën Iushkevich from maybe a little bit different point of view. Our next speaker is LeiAnna Hamel. She's a PhD candidate in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literature, and minor in Jewish Culture and Society at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. LeiAnna's research focuses on gender and sexuality in Russian and Yiddish literatures. She's also the current editorial associate in Gevet, a journal of Yiddish studies. LeiAnna, please, we are ready to listen.
Great. Thank you. Thank everyone for being here, and also thank you especially to the organizers for organizing this. So to begin, Semën Iushkevich's depictions of urban prostitution portray Odessa as disordered, licentious, and criminally capitalistic. I'm assuming because nobody's yelled at me yet, everybody can hear me? Yes? Cool. Okay. Thank you.
Perfect.
Iushkevich was one of many authors who wrote critiques of the marked increase in urban prostitution throughout Imperial Russia at the turn of the 20th century. Sex work was legal in the Russian Empire. However, diverse authors expressed concern that the sex trade could not be sufficiently regulated to safeguard the population from venereal disease and urban disorder. Writers from the field of literature, medicine, anthropology, and journalism sought to know and thus control the prostitute's body and behavior. Their texts also identified the spaces of her domestic and international circulation. Odessa, an already mythologized space of criminal activity, was inscribed in the discourses of prostitution as a den of iniquity from which devious, typically Jewish procurers carried women off to the far-flung capitals of the Middle East and the Americas and forced them into prostitution in a stereotype that was called white slavery at the time. This paper will show how Iushkevich, a Russian Jewish writer and medical doctor from Odessa, engaged with early 20th century discourses of prostitution. I focus on his 1911 novella, The Street, Ulitsa. In contrast to non-fictional accounts that categorize Odessa as a transportation hub, Iushkevich explores the sex trade among the city's impoverished Jewish community. The Street's protagonist is the underage and unregistered Jewish streetwalker Sonia. The novella recounts her initiation into illegal street prostitution, her infection with an unspecified venereal disease, and her later turn to brothel prostitution. The narrative represents Sonia's fall spatially, as it tracks her movement from a peripheral neighborhood to Odessa's main thoroughfare, Deribasovska. The street follows Sonia's movements across Odessa largely from her perspective, expressed through indirect free discourse. The novella thus guides the reader from Odessa's slums to its glittering boulevards, parks, alleyways, and hotel rooms through the eyes of an illegal sex worker. The street literalizes Michel Desauteur's claim that urban walking practices become a text of the city. According to Desauteur, governmental and institutional bodies structure the city through strategies like urban planning and policing. However, it is the pedestrians who bring the city to life. Individuals employ tactics, meaning everyday actions like walking, that intentionally or unintentionally subvert the established narratives that official strategies produce. A good example of this is something that's called a desire path, where you have the pavement, but you can see from the marks in the grass that people cut across places. Michel Foucault's theories of knowledge and power position the medical discourses surrounding prostitution as another form of the social body's discipline and control. Iushkevich uses the motif of street walking to subvert official narratives of the cityscape, not Odessa specifically, but sort of the abstract concept of the city, and to challenge extant medical and literary depictions of sex work at the time. The street is a modernist literary text, and yet Iushkevich considered submitting the street as a thesis about the impact of urban poverty on public health to his Parisian medical school. The novella's episodic form and subjective narration enable Iushkevich to explore lesser studied facets of the urban sex trade, namely the pleasure, despair, and disorientation that sex workers experience when engaging in urban prostitution. Iushkevich arrives at the same conclusion about prostitution's cause as many of his contemporaries, that it is primarily motivated by socioeconomic factors instead of by the inherent sexual deviance of sex workers. The latter view was expressed most succinctly by the Italian School of Criminal Anthropology, Cesare Lombroso and Veniamin Tarnowski, for example. However, the ways that he portrays prostitution are unusual. Iushkevich's The Street explores the significance of subversive walking through the protagonist's subjective perspective to participate in public health discourses. The result is a decentralized perspective on the sex trade in Odessa, a city already on the margins of the Russian Empire. Through her illegal street walking, Iushkevich's heroine Sonia resists the dominant narrative of the city. Again, like the city as an abstract concept, not Odessa itself, which is typically depicted as being disordered, as a rationally organized space that promotes social progress. She also evades the medical police committee that sought to control the bodies and movements of streetwalkers. Sonia's tactics of subversion interrupt the normal functioning of central urban spaces. She does so by using places like Odessa's Deribasovska Street as a stage where she markets her body to potential clients. Sonia's subversion of movement practices, such as sensuously strolling along busy boulevards, accompanies her rejection of social and sexual norms. The street problematizes female mobility and participation in the public sphere, especially the urban marketplace, by sexualizing women who appear in urban spaces. I will show how the street plots streetwalkers' movements throughout Odessa in order to construct a cultural geography of the city with the body of the prostitute at its center. Furthermore, I will discuss how Iushkevich's streetwalker characters, commodities themselves, amplified the desire for consumption among the urban population through the repurposing of public space. Iushkevich shows the collapse of social boundaries on Deribasovska in several scenes told from an omniscient narrator's perspective. These descriptions echo Nikolai Gogol's 1835 story Nevsky Prospekt in their thematic focus on both the street and prostitution. Gogol's text is set in St. Petersburg and exposes the falsity of the street's phantasmagoria through its two plot lines, one of which shows how an artist falls in love with a prostitute, which leads to his suicide. Nevsky Prospekt, among Gogol's other Petersburg tales, was an early example of the Petersburg text. Its opening scene comprises a physiological sketch, a sociologically oriented genre that was popular in the 1830s and 40s Russian literature. The narrator describes the different social types that stroll along the boulevard at particular times of the day, before turning to the two protagonists' unhappy romances. Iushkevich's intertextual references to Nevsky Prospekt show that he engaged with the earlier Petersburg text tradition in order to construct his own Odessa text. Iushkevich thus exports both medical discourses and literary devices from the imperial capital to explore the illicit sex trade on the empire's margin. The connection between the Petersburg text tradition, especially Gogol's Nevsky Prospect and Iushkevich's The Street, is particularly significant in the sketch of the street that occurs in the middle of the novella. In this scene, the narrator walks the reader through a representative day and night on Deribasovskaya and describes the different groups that comprise the pedestrians. In contrast to Gogol's description of discrete social types entering the street at a particular time, so for example, he writes that titular councilors are typically on Nevsky Prospect at 9 a.m.? Yes. Iushkevich portrays a radical mixing of classes, technology, and sounds. In so doing, Iushkevich modifies the physiological sketch genre to suit his modernist poetics. Quote, ladies, soldiers, brokers, street prostitutes, old women, pimps, soldiers, generals, the poor and the rich collide, disperse, again gather together, meet each other, and walk next to each other. Carriages drag themselves along the wooden pavement. Automobiles fly, smoking and sputtering. Trotter horses race, bicyclists glide. Bells, the drawn-out howl of sirens, the sounds of horns, loud conversations, and laughter merge into a mottled hum. And it is like that until evening. End quote. The pedestrians become an undifferentiated mass. The narrator later says that at night, quote, the many-headed, many-eyed crowd slowly crawls, end quote. The narrator recreates the disorientation that the modern street's cacophony produces. Human voices blend with technological sounds, and the speed of vehicles contrasts with the slowness of the crawling crowd. Instead of discrete elements, everything blends together synesthetically. However, the streetwalkers move in circles that stimulate the flow of pedestrians, however slow that flow might be, which highlights their alternate movement practices. The narrator emphasizes the permanence of the prostitute on the street, saying, quote, streetwalkers have been in the crowd for a long time. Old, young, ugly, pretty, adolescents, children, beautifully and poorly dressed. They are always here and seem to constitute a part of Deribasovskaya, like the houses, the garden, and the asphalt pavement, end quote. The prostitutes' bodies fuse with the street in this simile. They are the only class of people that the narrator singles out from the mass crowd for specific consideration. The places that the narrator enumerates are also telling. It seems like the sex workers are permanent fixtures of Odessa, like the houses. They offer a space for the mixing of people, like the garden, and they are a modern and public feature of the city, like the asphalt street. Prostitutes then permanently occupy the street and inject surplus desire into the everyday life of the population. This passage also suggests that the entire empire is condensed on the city street, in that all of its representatives encounter one another there. Order is disturbed by the fact that a prostitute and a general occupy the same space. The physiological sketches of Deribasovskaya provide a larger picture of the disruptive impact that street prostitution has on the population and its movement throughout the cityscape. So, as mentioned above, these streetwalkers are moving differently from the general mass of people. In contrast to the crowd that flows from one end of the street to the other, the prostitutes walk in a circle or flit in and out of the crowd. Sex workers advertise themselves by glancing seductively at the passerby, touching them conspicuously or inconspicuously, and trying to entice them into hotel rooms. These actions subvert the intention of major city thoroughfares, that is, to facilitate the movement from one part of the city to another. Instead, sex workers interrupt this utilitarian movements of the masses. In his writings about the flaneur and the Paris arcades, Walter Benjamin emphasizes the pleasure derived from looking at commodities, luxury or otherwise, as one strolls through the city streets. Benjamin noted that the advertisements, window displays, and prostitutes' bodies that peppered the modern thoroughfares drew the pedestrians' attention, causing them to slow down and engage in scopophilic activities. Similar to other forms of advertising, the prostitute's body is on display on the city street. Her performance of seduction resembles an advertisement. She tries to show her body in the most attractive light by slowly sauntering on the city street in the nicest clothing she can afford. The author of the non-fictional text Prostitution v России claims that all prostitutes try to imitate the latest fashion trends of high society, with the resulting tastelessness of their clothes, quote, serving as an advertisement, vyviska, of that trade that constitutes their inescapable affiliation. Significantly, several scenes in the street depict Sonia gazing longingly into shop windows. The sight of beautiful commodities drives her to work harder, not only so that she can ensure her family's economic survival, but also so that she can secure her own social position as a consumer, not just a commodity. Iushkevich highlights a different facet of the prostitute's body as an advertisement in his short story Pity, Zhalost, from 1903. The story opens with the Jewish streetwalker Lisa strolling seductively on an unnamed Odessa street. Her enticing movements awaken desires in both the male and female passerby who read it differently. Namely, the thought that they could possess this woman for the price of a few coins entrances the men. Women passerby envy Lisa's ability to openly partake in pleasure and, from a working class woman's perspective, potentially to earn a better wage. In both cases, the prostitute's body seemingly opportunities to both its consumers and its suppliers. However, Iushkevich underlines the negative aspects of the commodified female body in both texts by exploring the psychological and physical damage that the sex trade has on the sex workers themselves. Images of Odessa become more sinister in the second half of the street, which signals Sonia's changing relationship to both the urban environment and to her profession. In the first half of the novella, Iushkevich uses the technique of indirect free discourse to express Sonia's enchantment with the noise and motion of the city street, as well as her seeming intoxication from performing her work. These scenes occur, quote unquote, on the ground, that is, from Sonia's perspective as she moves around the city streets. One of the only panoramic views of Odessa, I mean panoramic here is in top down, not what we saw earlier with the physiological sketch, of Odessa appears as the narrative follows Sonia from her peripheral neighborhood onto Deribasovska. In this scene, the park where Sonia meets her friends in order to walk to the city center together is covered in snow, which defamiliarizes the space in her eyes. Similarly, Odessa itself takes on a new monstrous dimension as she gazes at the city from afar. Quote, "For 10 versts around, everything lived, breathed, and existed by debauchery. Generations of young bodies were bred there below and here above and threw themselves into the giant maw of the city, like a victim to a monster, who possibly will be appeased and will allow one to breathe easily. The first victim has perished, and the second one is already ready, having only just gathered strength and sap, walking with faith, stretching out her hand to that maw." End quote. Once removed from the intoxicating disorientation of Odessa's main thoroughfares, Sonia perceives the city as a monster that consumes the bodies of young women. This hellish characterization, especially the first line, recalls the Yiddish phrase, "the fires of Gehenna burn for 7 miles around Odessa." The passage mythologized Sonia's experience in Odessa's sex trade. The spaces below and above from which the depersonalized young bodies are cast into the maw, poist, of Odessa refer to the lower class neighborhoods in and near the city center. The use of the word victim, жертва, shows that Sonia sees these women, herself included, as helpless victims, destroyed by degrading processes that pervade the city. However, Sonia continues to deploy the tactics of subversion that frustrate the structure of that city. Based on this passage, the perspective on prostitution in the street is consistent with other cultural critics who adopted a socioeconomic perspective on the problem of prostitution. The material conditions that lower class women found themselves in, especially extreme poverty, combined with their naivete, directly caused the city to, quote unquote, have its way with them and to transform them into debauched women. So to conclude, Iushkevich ultimately accuses Odessa of causing Sonia's fall. In so doing, he participates in the broader discussion of the socioeconomic circumstances that lead to prostitution, a well-developed strain of thought in late Imperial Russian literary and non-fictional texts. In contrast to other texts that attempt to take an objective perspective, employing statistics and other methodologies like that on the sex trade and the diagnosis of its ills, Iushkevich emphasizes the subjective perspective of his marginalized protagonist, Sonia. Sonia's illicit street walking structures the narrative. She effectively guides the reader on a tour of the infernal side of Odessa. The street thus uses the discourses on prostitution to propagate the image of Odessa as a space of criminality, exploitation, and disorder. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, LeiAnna, for your thought-provoking presentation. And our last but not least speaker is Dr. Inna Shtakser from Tel Aviv University. Inna is an author of the book, The Making of Jewish Revolutionaries in the Pale of Settlement, published by Palgraf Macmillan in 2014, In addition, she has published several articles on radicalization among working class Jews of the Pale and on such Jews as participants in political violence. Her current project deals with working class anarchism in the post-1905 Odessa. And Ina is going to speak today about expropriations and the demise of the anarchist movement in Odessa. Please, Ina.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to the organizers. Thank you, Ephraim. And I begin. So this paper uses Odessa as a case study to illustrate why the decisions of anarchist communists and anarchist syndicalists to finance their activities through robberies and extortion, rather than through membership fees and donations, contributed to the demise of those movements in 1908. I chose Odessa because, owing to this status as a port city, many anarchists there were newly arrived, impoverished immigrants. This dynamic meant that Odessa, unlike other anarchist centers in the Russian Empire, such as Bialystok and Yekaterinoslav, lacked in established working class culture which anarchists, those newly arrived anarchists, could identify. In the absence of such a culture and its associated values, the local anarchist movement in Odessa was particularly vulnerable to the corruption and criminality ushered in by the decision to rely on robbery and extortion for funding this group's activism. Drawing on articles published in the contemporary Odessa press, as well as writings of local anarchists, I trace how this decision undermined this organization's initial popularity among local workers, that is, how it led workers to see these organizations as criminal entities rather than political ones. This changed perception, I argue, was the product of local leaders' failure to strike a balance between upholding traditional working class values and pursuing fundraising activities such as extortion and robbery that exposed these organizations to corruption and to infiltration by criminal elements. Anarchist militant leaders in Odessa, as we shall see, were more tolerant of members using funds obtained in this manner for non-revolutionary or personal reasons than were anarchists in other cities. They were also more willing to turn a blind eye to criminal groups claiming to be anarchists than was the case elsewhere. As noted above, anarchism was initially very popular among the working class in the Russian Empire. Disappointed by outcome of the 1905 revolution, many workers in Odessa and elsewhere gravitated towards anarchist groups because they seemed more committed to revolutionary activities than other revolutionary organizations. The changed mood of the working classes and its impact on political affiliations did not go unnoticed by authorities in Odessa. A 1906 police department notification directed to the heads of Odessa gubernia departments of political police and of investigation centers reported. Among workers there is much enthusiasm toward anarchism, no longer trusting the limits imposed by the Socialist Committee on Activism, which in the view of workers makes activism too peaceful. They have joined the anarchists whose belligerent ideas correspond best to their current excited mood. In short, anarchism's newfound popularity among workers stemmed from the ideological justification it provided for violent self-assertion against employers who had reneged on promises made during the revolutionary upheaval and against a newly confident and oppressive local police force. Yet this enthusiasm quickly soared as workers became disenchanted with anarchist primary sources of revenue, expropriation, which organization members defined as politically motivated robberies and extortion. Anarchists justified this method of funding by claiming that they were taking resources from the government and from the bourgeoisie that had been gained at workers' expense. Instead of using these resources to perpetuate a system of exploitation, they would use them to advance working class interests. In making this argument, they also rejected membership fees and donations from bourgeois sympathizers as potential funding sources. The former, they asserted, placed too heavy a burden on impoverished workers. The latter was ethically unacceptable because it required courting the enemy of the working classes, the bourgeoisie. However, funding through expropriations also proved problematic, exposing anarchist groups to allegations of immoral and criminal conduct, which in Odessa were often justified. Local anarchist groups, made up of mostly young, impoverished, or even unemployed workers, often lacked the organizational and financial resources to carry out large-scale expropriations, and thus often targeted local neighborhood businesses. Because the owners of the small-scale businesses were often not significantly better off than their attackers, it was difficult to justify these attacks ideologically. This problem was compounded by the fact that local criminal elements, cognizant of the group's organizational weaknesses, joined in the actions or committed robberies posing as anarchists. As a result, not all expropriations were used for political purposes. Exposure to these criminal elements also led to the corruption of some genuine anarchists who began pocketing some or all expropriated money for personal use. As the line between the political and the criminal became increasingly blurred, workers ceased to see anarchists as their defenders. Without worker support, anarchist groups became easy targets for suppression by the government. In fact, some working class members chose to assist the police in rounding up anarchists. On August 17, 1908, in an Odessa working class Peresev neighborhood, resident Mincia Davidson informed police that at the request of a local anarchist, she had provided accommodation to an anarchist called Mania. However, after agreeing to accommodate the woman, she had second thoughts. The woman, she told the police, had revealed that she planned to take part in robbing a factory and in kidnapping a child. Davidson's report led to the woman's arrest. The decision to report the woman to the police could not have been an easy one for Davidson, given widespread distrust of the police among the working classes and the movement's earlier popularity within the working class. Certainly, it is possible that Davidson only reported the woman because she believed the woman to be a criminal who had infiltrated the movement. Kidnapping a child was not a common fundraising ploy for anarchists. It happened in Odessa once, though. However, even if this was Davidson's motivation, the police archives include numerous stories of passers-by who interfered on behalf of small businesses targeted by anarchists. For example, on September 2nd, 1906, Novaya Obozrenie, a local newspaper, reported an attempt to extort money from an Odessa carpentry store owner, which ended when the nearby butchers attacked both the extortionist and the store owner, whom they mistook as also being an anarchist because he was conversing with the extortionists. On February 22nd, 21st, 1906, another local newspaper, Южное обозрение, carried the story of an anarchist attempted robbery in a bakery where the perpetrators were attacked by the neighbors. The local press, although sympathetic towards revolutionaries in general, also perceived anarchists as criminals. On October 1st, 1907, Родное дело, an Odessa newspaper, published an article titled The Anarchist by an obviously progressive journalist identified only as Enge. In that article, he described why in his city anarchists were perceived as criminals. Extortion, regular extortion, robberies accompanied by murders, whether intended or not, are all proudly claimed as anarchist practices. Simple thieves who previously in the dead of night broke into the homes of strangers now proclaim themselves to be politically motivated robbers, since this makes their activities seem more noble and productive. Hundreds of organizations and groups under various names emerge each day and compete against each other to rob and terrorize the population and to destroy people's lives. No one, whether rich or poor, is immune from becoming a victim to this. Modern predators that have corrupted the consciousness of the ignorant masses. He also described why, in his view, their actions contributed to the upcoming political reaction rather than the revolution. They are the enemies of society and the best friends of the political right. The ignorant and frightened resident cannot differentiate among various parties. He cannot differentiate between a militant and a regular extortionist. He fears anything that reminds him of a revolutionary underground. The extortionists and the murderers, through their unclean touch, dirty the banner which they pretend to follow. They misuse the social idea, which has thousands of supporters in the West, turning it into a means of thievery and of personal enrichment. They call themselves anarchists in order to frighten the population. Even more by a scary word. Anarchist in Odessa means a professional robber and murderer. K.L. Olenin, another progressive journalist, spoke similarly in his article, Heroes of the Bomb, that appeared in Odessa Gazeta on July 16, 1906. He also communicated the idea that anarchists were simply robbers, or at best, unemployed workers engaged in crime to stave off hunger. Our Russian anarchists do nothing to destroy the state or the existing society. They understand that this is impossible. They dedicate themselves almost solely to expropriations, which in the eyes of our contemporaries are simply robberies. Olenin also explained that in Russia, anarchists are clearly not political, since no truly political organization would prioritize robbery and extortion at the expense of ignoring political propaganda. He noted that robbers claim to be anarchists to exploit the existing public sympathy for revolutionaries. Agreeing with Enge, he also claimed that by abusing such sympathy, anarchists assisted conservatives in their effort to discredit the new freedom, that is, the newly acquired rights of free expression that are made legal by the October 1905 manifesto. Thus, the local press argued that in Odessa, more than elsewhere, criminals were not only impersonating anarchists, but they were also infiltrating their ranks with impunity. Boris Gurev, a social democrat, noted in his 1917 book that Odessa anarchists were more tolerant towards the influx of criminals into their organizations than anarchists in Yekaterinoslav and Bialystok. Gurev claimed that in their cities, Anarchists assimilated the values associated with established working class communities and so were less accepting of criminality. However, in Odessa, a port city where the population was more in flux, the working class culture was less stable, and so associated values exercised less influence on anarchists as well. The newspaper The Anarchist painted a similar negative portrait of Odessa anarchists. All who worked in the anarchist movement in Odessa and among those who noted the anarchist communist actions had no choice but to notice this. Often the idea of anarchism was perverted. Often the masses did not understand it. Thus, disgusting deeds using the name of anarchism often took place, such as various cases of extortion, threatening letters, small-scale robberies. The numerous expropriations in Odessa became an embarrassment to local anarchists, especially since many criminals used the name of anarchists to glorify their robberies. 21-year-old anarchist Moisei Metz, who belonged to the Black Banner Черное Знамя contingent, anarchist communist contingent, was executed in November 1906 for bombing Liebman's coffee house, spoke bitterly of such imposters during his trial. Recently, some groups have emerged that use death threats to extort money and then spend that money on extravagant orgies. Such groups, to ensure success, call themselves anarchist communists. But what do such extortionists have to do with anarchists wishing to create a new life on the ruins of the existing regime? There is no difference between these extortionists and those they extort. The bourgeoisie exploits workers' lives to earn money. Those expropriating this money utilize it for depraved orgies and drunkenness, just like the bourgeoisie. We are not surprised, since the existing regime can give birth only to moral cripples. Metz, who had no moral qualms with robberies, since private property in his view was an immoral source of oppression, was, however, concerned that such robberies jeopardized the popular image of the revolution for which he was about to sacrifice his life. Other anarchists, like the previously cited progressive journalists, also worried about criminals joining the anarchists for financial gain and about militants becoming corrupted and criminalized through access to expropriated money. Some even agreed that expropriations destroyed the political character of the groups. Daniil Novomirsky, in his 1907 booklet, Excerpts from the Program of Anarcho-Syndicalism, pointed out that too often expropriators pretending to be anarchists were simply people without any means of support, who were willing to join any extremist organization, pro or anti-revolutionary. Such individuals employed violence indiscriminately and falsely represented their wish for financial gain as political. He claimed that such people had no political views. They exploited extreme political ideologies to present their criminal activities as political, when in reality such activities posed no challenge to the existing social structure. Expropriations also tended to corrupt genuine militants. For example, under the umbrella of the anarchist communist organization, the Black Banner, there were many groups that relied exclusively on terror to fund their activism. These groups that were teeny in size lacked resources, and their members were often impoverished or unemployed workers. Given their isolation from working class communities and their dire political circumstances, it is not surprising that they soon began using the funds that they expropriated from small businesses and individual businessmen to satisfy personal needs. Corruption, however, was not unique to the small groups. Within the larger anarcho-syndicalist trend, A similar development occurred among groups that were committed to, as well as able to carry out larger-scale expropriations that targeted government and business institutions. When such expropriations were successful, these groups were suddenly flush with money. This sudden influx of cash proved too tempting for some members who began siphoning off some funds to improve their personal economic situation. Some anarchists went so far as to spend money on showy extravagances. This flaunting of their spoils did not sit well with their working class neighbors. Anarchists who had been seen as champions of the working classes were now viewed as common criminals. This changed perception, although not the primary reason for the demise of Odessa anarchist groups in 1908, certainly made it easier for the government to repress the movement. In his memoir, Novomirsky described his shock upon arriving in Odessa to organize the local anarchists and hearing how negatively workers viewed the movement. He wrote on the situation of October 1905 as follows. Potemkin days in Odessa made anarchists well known in the city. People started discussing them seriously, but it would be wrong to assume that their reputation was positive. Workers considered anarchists bomb throwers capable of desperate acts.
Last minute, please.
Of terror, but somewhat dishonest with money. In November 1905, this negative perception, Novomirsky relied, had become more pronounced. When I outlined our views on capitalism and on the state, as well as on how to struggle against the existing regime, one young student asked me, anarchists have a worldview? I thought they were another sort of pogromists, and many supported the words of that naive student. Certainly Novomirsky, an anarchist syndicalist, had political reasons to criticize the competing anarchist communist Black Banner, whom he blamed for the negative image of anarchists among the population. However, he was not the only one uncomfortable about the connection between anarchism and criminality in the popular mind. This discomfort was also expressed by members of the Black Banner trend, such as Eliasberg, who had been sentenced to 20 years of forced labor for an expropriation. From the prison, Eliasberg wrote, an enormous shady stream of partial expropriations, mandates, namely extortion, and other fields, often in the most disgusting circumstances, and not even one positive anarchist act. Indeed, expropriations attracted individuals whose political commitment was dubious, introduced common criminals into the rank of anarchist groups, and corrupted, ideologically motivated anarchists. This risk became more pronounced as the political cohesiveness of groups became compromised by frequent arrests and the inability of leaders to control members. A police report on an Odessa group of anarchist communists active during 1906-1907 noted this very issue. This group, due to frequent arrests, had no real organization, and each member acts individually, even in the case of terrorist acts and expropriations. As a result, those acts turn into regular robberies. There is no contact between group members. For robberies or extortion, groups of 3 to 6 members agree among themselves to organize these actions. Once committed, they divide the loot and separate immediately. The money is spent on carousing. Once spent, they get together, commit another robbery, separate, etc. This pattern among the same political report continued until Novomirsky returned in Odessa in 1905 and organized local anarchists into a truly political group. While one might doubt the veracity of the police report, the corroborating statements of Novomirsky and Eliasberg, as well as the action of workers who chose to protect small businesses, point to the accuracy of this report. By 1908, anarchist movement in the Russian Empire had largely disappeared. The decision to rely on appropriation undermined the movement's popularity with working class communities because it introduced corruption and criminality into the movement. In Odessa, where anarchists were less rooted in the local working class communities, this shift from political activism to criminal action was more pronounced and proved ruinous for the local movement. Workers who had once supported the movement now saw anarchists as common criminals. In some cases, they even intervened on behalf of local businesses or reported anarchist activities to the police. Increasingly isolated and disavowed by working class communities as common criminals, anarchist groups became easy targets for government repression. The police labeled them as criminals, and because their actions seemingly supported this label, authorities encountered little resistance from working class communities when they rounded up legitimate anarchist expropriations, a fundraising method initially intended to ensure the organization independence from the bourgeoisie and to avoid overburdening the impoverished working classes had backfired. Rather than bolstering the group's revolutionary credentials, it ultimately destroyed the movement's reputation as a legitimate political movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ina. Thank you for your presentation. And we have already many questions, and I'm going, the first who send me the questions, the first I read. So first of all, my questions, yeah. And my first question is to Professor Gerasimov about your comparison between the images of Odessa and Vilnius, when you describe the actually wrong, misleading images of Odessa as a city of sins, while Vilna as quiet, provincial, and very decent one. Could you explain what actually produced such images? Who adopted, how they were adopted, and actually why? And my second question to LeiAnna, actually about the impact of the Imperial Russian literature on Iushkevich's images, Iushkevich's heroes. When you gave your presentation, I saw about, for instance, Dostoevsky's also Sonia, but Sonia Marmeladova from Crime and Punishment, and also to some extent Netochka Nezvanova, also by Dostoevsky. So could you please explain about the impact of the let's say, big literature on local issues? And the last question to Ina about the anarchists in Odessa. If they were just simple criminals, robbery, everything, killing, so what for they need all this ideological camouflage? They could rob and kill without any socialist or anarchist ideas, as they did before in the middle of 19th century or beginning of 19th century. So what had happened that they put this ideological camouflage? Yes, and one more question we have from Professor Horowitz. Brian wrote to LeiAnna, very good paper, thank you. My question is, they should be beware that function differs from reality, and then Iushkevich is interested in prescription, fighting prostitution, as in description. Moreover, the gaze onto the female body belongs to a male fiction writer. Is there a line between reality and literature that the critics of literature should not cross? Okay, let's start with these questions and then we will continue to the rest. Who wants to start?
Or should I start since I received the
Yes,
question?
go ahead, my pleasure.
I was breaking signal, so I missed the very thrust of your question. So the question was about who developed this imagery?
wrong images of Odessa and Vilna. You described Vilna as much more corrupted.
Yeah. I mean the very focus of the question. That was I didn't get. Practically, this is the question to my literary studies colleagues, because I was studying, the problem of the correlation or the lack of thereof of social practices and everyday experience of people, and the ways that these experiences and practices were represented in textual world, in public discourses. Clearly, this was the job done by educated elite, which in practice was middle-class intelligentsia, low middle-class intelligentsia, and they say locally in Odessa or on the empire-wide scale, they succeeded in developing a language, imagery, tropes, and discourses, narratives that and framed Odessan experience in a certain way. There were much more murders per capita in Nizhny Novgorod than in Odessa. There were more prostitutes in Vilna than in Odessa. Eugene Avrutin showed how the practice of Jewish community life in Vilna had nothing in common with the ways that community leaders framed rhetorically the rules of the game, how they, people in Vilna, Belarusian prostitutes spoke Yiddish with their employers. This is a multilingual society. Everyone poorly spoke several languages, including their own. But writers, journalists were using this already. It's turn of the century, so the prevailing national-centered idiom framed their imagery, and they had to use this. Some writers, some literary texts are very perceptive, but this is a different dynamics, and it's fascinating to see how this reality acquired reality, the life of its own, independent of social sphere. So I don't know who exactly did that. I was looking for exactly the very. I registered the gap between representation and not reality as it actually was, but the experience that we can read through human actions. I put it this way: two different secondary modeling systems, two different meta-narratives in human actions, can communicate human actions, and in words.
Okay, thank you. At least our Litvak brothers may feel as normal as Ukrainian one. Okay, LeiAnna?
Yes, thank you for your questions. In terms of the impact of Imperial Russian literature on Iushkevich's tворчество, and speaking to Sonia Marmeladova in particular, so what I'm trying to do in this chapter of the dissertation is, and I think I probably didn't bring it out enough in this particular presentation, but there's a huge shift in the literary representation of prostitution from the late 19th century and into the early 20th. So we have a phrase in English, the hooker with the heart of gold, and that tends to characterize a lot of late 19th century characterizations of prostitutes, particularly Sonia Marmeladova. I think Iushkevich sort of plays with that trope, and he tries to introduce more sociological elements into his prose. In line with the burgeoning naturalism that was happening in the early 20th century, where you try to describe the dirty grit of reality. And to speak to Professor Horowitz's question, again, this is a very complicated issue of representation, because we have a male author who's trying to enter into the mind of a 13-year-old girl who's practicing prostitution. And I think in terms of developing this forward, I will absolutely try to figure out how to talk about that better, and also the ethical implications of this, because it's a rather strange thing, because at the same time, he is being prescriptive in terms of, this is in a certain sense like a social critique calling for the abolition of prostitution in a sense, but at the same time, a lot of the scenes really stage pleasure. Like they stage the pleasures of the body. And we as readers are sort of implicated in this because in certain scenes, we're also gazing at Sonia as she gazes at herself in the mirror. And so we're looking at the sexualized body of an underage, like really quite young, because I think she's 12 when she first starts engaging in street prostitution. Body. Sorry, my cat wants to participate. Yes, so that's what I can say for now. And I will absolutely take these questions forward and try to work through them as I continue refining this chapter. Thank you.
Thank you. Ina?
Thank you. Hi to the cat. Now, there are two reasons why those groups wish to claim that they are anarchists. One is intimidation, another is legitimation. What do I mean? Intimidation. Anarchist groups, real anarchist groups, engaged in expropriations. And as far as anarchists are concerned, everybody knew that they are the kind of people who do not mind sacrificing their lives. Totally. I mean, they were known for this, and this was also their self-perception. I mean, an anarchist who was considering getting married got a lot of flack from his or her comrades because, I mean, what will happen when you will perish? And the idea is you will perish. It's just a matter of several months. So those people were scary, genuinely scary. Another reason, legitimacy. In all of those extortion and extortion attempts, robbery attempts, people got requests for money which looked pretty official. Basically, the idea was that the organization has a right to claim money from people, from well-to-do people, and from businesses. In a way, you can say that they presented their expropriations as a sort of taxation rather than a sort of criminal activity. And people really did not know how to deal with this. I mean, it was something that people accepted to some extent. Depends on the situation, really.
Okay, thank you. I have many more questions, therefore please be very precise and short in your answers. So we have one more question from Brian Horowitz to Galina. It's in Russian, so I read Brian's text. Кто был обычный читатель у Iushkevich? Был ли он буржуй, который хотел смотреть вниз на менее удачных, чтобы чувствовать себя хорошо? Были другие причины для успеха Iushkevich как писателя?
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Horowitz, for your questions. First of all, about common reader. It seems to me that at that period...
Would you speak up, please?
Yes, I...
Чуть громче.
Excuse me. It seems to me that about common reader, most of his prose was published in periodicals. So in periodicals, and we can speak about democratic circles, Narodniki, and in the letter to Vengerov about his autobiography, he wrote about his closeness to Marxism. So it seems to me that he belonged to the democratic milieu in Odessa's circle of the writers, and he belongs to, we know this history about his participation in Gorky's Znamia. So it was clear that he belonged to the, he addressed to democratic readers, but we know that it was popular among not only good literature was popular not among those who belong to the left side. As about his bourgeoisness, I can't say that he even thought he is a bourgeois. He, as it seems to me, he understood himself as a Democrat. And it is an interesting episode which described Voznesensky, his colleague from Odessa and Listok. And he describes an episode in restaurant when Bunin paid 10 rubles, I don't know how much, to the официант, he paid too much in the restaurant, and Iushkevich, he was surprised, and he said that it's too much. And Voznesensky wrote, it is obvious that Bunin was a nobleman, and Iushkevich, he behaved like a Democrat. Is there any other reasons for his popularity? Maybe his talent, and also we can say that he was always successful because he was very provocable. But his success, it seems to me, based on the on his ideas of writing of the actual themes. So he belonged to the group of the writers which were popular in this moment, and he was always in literary dialogue with his colleagues. And for example, his explanation about his Ulitsa, for him it was a dialogue with Kuprin, with his Yama and so on, because he has an idea. So his success based on the ideas of his time, it seems to me.
Thank you, Galina. And the next question comes from Professor Zaur Gasimov to LeiAnna. Was the prostitution described in the novel always female, or the author described it also examples of male prostitution? And another question comes from Professor Scott Uri to Ina. How different were the anarchists from the other socialist or revolutionary groups at that time, including the PPS and the Bund, which both turned to expropriations in the post-revolutionary era and perhaps also lost support due to these strategies? And please briefly, we have very limited time.
I can just say that in the novella, male prostitution is not mentioned. However, one of the largest studies of that particular period of child prostitution does mention male prostitution. See, the prostitute during this period was almost considered like the archetype of female deviance. So it was typically assigned to women, first of all. Second of all, I think we even have this problem now that most of the studies about prostitution tend to focus on female participants in it, not so much male ones. That's a pretty recent discourse. However, the title of the big study of child prostitution is «Детская проституция в Петербурге», по-моему. Хорошо, спасибо.
Yes, Ina?
Yes, sure. Other revolutionary organizations engaged in expropriations, but there was one very important difference between them and the anarchists. The difference was that other revolutionary organizations were against expropriations in principle, though not always in practice. Anarchists were not against expropriations in principle. Now, this is a little bit simplifying things, because in the anarchist press of the time, there was a very extended and interesting debate about expropriations. But in terms of popular perception, anarchists were robbers. Anarchists were people who engaged in expropriation and who supported this. What did not help the anarchists in their image, in the resulting image problem, is that within the revolutionary movement, they were known as people who were who were often, especially in prisons, siding with common criminals against the political prisoners, claiming that the political prisoners are the bourgeoisie and the common criminals are the working classes. Was it as selfless as it sounds? Not necessarily. In fact, the anarchists worked very hard to conduct propaganda among criminals, and what they were saying, and it makes a lot of sense, is that if somebody is not going to do this, those people are going to join the Black Hundreds. Mm-hmm. And somebody has to do this. So there was some sense to this, but the fact is that all the other revolutionary organizations, without exception, blamed, okay, to some extent, some exception, maybe anarchist maximalists, okay, but not too much, blamed the anarchists consistently for being criminals, and it worked. It worked.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yes, I see we have a couple of questions from Miria. First of all, to Ilia, the question: what do we know about aggression of to passers-by during pogroms, urban riots? The pogromists had to read bodies, read in quotation marks, and clothes in order to direct their aggression. Kuprian writes about this in Gambrinus. Are there sources available?
It's a long. A proper discussion will be too long for the time that's left for now. I had to remove the chapter discussing Odessa pogrom and other pogroms in Belostok, for example, here, from my book, because it was too. It was too complicated and too provocative to already agitated peer reviewers. When you try to read slowly this pogrom as text, it really presents very complex picture. There are probably a dozen, 2 dozen of really insane murders who in short time killed dozens of people. There are crowds that perform in this traditional ritual of symbolic violence. They pretend, Jews pretend that they hit somewhere where local people know all the places you really can't hide. But Jews pretend that they hit somewhere. The pogromist crowd pretended that they couldn't find Jews. At some point, Jews paid some known criminals to look after their cows, to feed them, and they obeyed contract and save these cows from the pogromist crowd. I mean, and this is the ritual. This is the old ritual from the 19th century, 1870s. Others are very modern and genocidal, truly genocidal, murderous, World War II type, anti-Jewish violence. And others are just pragmatic arrangements when people decide that they should join in the movement and get something from it since it's already started. And together, these different patterns produce very complex picture. And it's still, I mean, when we, in an attempt to discuss it within the, say, framework of urban riot or some other meta-narrative, more nuanced, less predetermining the outcome, the conclusion. This work hasn't started yet for political reasons, for some analytical reasons. We just at the very beginning of this study, of this research. I wish we could discuss it.
And we have a couple more questions, short answers, please. Svetlana Nakovich, Dr. Svetlana Nakovich of Haifa University, to Professor Gerasimov also. The text is, okay. Unlike the typical riots in pogroms, middle-class literate population took a significant part. How did plebeians and middle-class strategies differed and overlapped and conflated? Would it be possible to claim that pogroms combined to the grammar of riots with additional components? And one more question also to Ilia and Inna, from Professor Frank Zicher. Do we know the ethnic composition of Odessa anarchists? What was their social background? How does this compare with other Russian cities? And maybe last but not least, also from Scott Uri to Professor Gerasimov, was Jewish working class assimilation via violence unique to Odessa or similar to many other urban cities in the empire? Either way, what does the example of Odessa teach us?
Shmuel, Shmuel, we really don't have time.
So maybe a couple of sentences each of you.
So one sentence, really one sentence, if possible. And I'm sorry, but
I can promise one sentence, but I try one brief paragraph. On the first question, Odessa, we can do this on Odessa material. I like the case of so-called pogrom in Kazan on October days of 1905, when this middle-class intelligentsia, one is exiled Pole, another is exiled Ukrainian intelligentsia, leaders of the proto-nationalist organization. They provided the crowd, agitated patriotic crowd, with addresses of Jewish enterprises and home addresses. So this agitated crowd moved to these addresses. They didn't know, though, and this is a plebeian crowd was serviced by middle-class intellectuals with the anti-Jewish scenario, but they didn't know how to behave. So they were just chanting, standing on the street, "We're going to beat up Jews. We're going to beat up Jews." And what next? So they never knew how to do this. They broke several glasses. There was some calamity, but this is when you see the difference between middle-class approach, liberated anti-Semitism as ideology, and the agitated crowd that could be pogromist. This is an urban riot, obviously, but they don't have the ready available scenario for pogrom in Kazan. In Odessa, it's much more complicated, of course. Yes. And the question about working class and violence, the best case here and the engagement of the working class with anarchism is provided again not by in Odessa by Belostok, where this was a working class movement when anarchists reached out to thousands of workers, they educated them. This was a genuine proletarian movement because workers and anarchists were mostly Jews. This ethnic component was virtually missing in Belostok. It was much more visible in Odessa, where anarchists had to explain the Jewishness, not Jewishness, the ethnicity of the victims. This was already complicated. In Belostok, where 80% were Jews, I mean, it's just everyone was human, everyone was Jewish. So that ethnicity didn't play a role. Working class was very prominently featured there. And the third question.
A question from Svetlana about the typical riots and pogroms.
This is already answered, Shmuel.
Already answered, sorry. So the Scott's question about the assimilation via violence unique, what different in Odessa you also answered, and social background composition. You also answered all the questions.
May I answer about the social background of anarchists?
Well, very, very, very shortly. In this case, I also add you one last issue about anarchists.
Shmuel, we really have no time. Sorry, I'm so really sorry, but we are restricted by the Zoom format, and I can see
anarchism in name only, people. Anarchism in name only.
Yeah. So, okay, thank you very much, all participants. We are really 5 minutes after the end of our session. So thank you, and hope to see you here after the short break of 15 minutes.